Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our last Global Public Sociology conversation on data visualization as public sociology. And before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the land on which York University is on before we get into the program. York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pond Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So you are all formally welcome to today's event. It's really my pleasure to be able to host Dr. Kieran Healy to York University, who is going to be in conversation with our very own Dr. Cary Wu. So the way the program will unfold is that I will introduce the speakers and then Dr. Kieran will go first, Dr. Healy will go first in terms of a presentation for about 30 minutes. He's asked that we keep him on time. So if you see me waving wildly, that's me saying your 30 minutes is up. Dr. Wu will go next with a presentation for about 15 minutes, and then we'll get into a conversation and a discussion at that point. So, and of course, as always happens with these events, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat or wait patiently until it is time for us to have, the Q&A conversation. This afternoon, we are being joined by Dr. Kieran Healy, who is a professor of sociology at Duke University. He is the author of Data Visualization, a Practical Introduction. His current work focuses on the moral order of market society, the effects of models and measurements on social classification, and the links between these two topics. Dr. Cary Wu is an assistant professor of sociology here at York University, and his research focuses on political culture, immigration, and inequality. He has published widely on these topics and often shares his research with the public via national and international television, radio, and newspaper forums, including NPR, CBC, and CTV, The Washington Post, Toronto Star, Maclean's Financial Times, and The Economist. And I would also like to especially thank Cary for organizing today's event and of course agreeing to speak to it. So I will turn us over now to Dr. Healy, and you have the virtual floor now.
Thank you very much. If you just give me a moment, I will share my screen here. So there we go. And I will bring up my my presentation over here like this. Okay, so thank you to Cary and to Sylvia for their invitation to speak and for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you've just heard, I've been asked to speak for about 30 to 35 minutes on this topic of data visualization as public sociology. So I'll say a little bit about data visualization, and then I'll say a little bit about public sociology, and then I'll say a little bit about the connection between those two things. I thought a good place to begin would be to go back to the early days of the pandemic in 2020. And sort of recall, I found myself when I was thinking about this talk sort of recalling how I had felt at the time and what I was doing at the time. And sort of by May or June, every day began in the same way. I got up, I made my coffee, and I looked at the data. And everything about that situation at the time was sort of absurd. To begin with, there was the absurdity that everybody with a job like mine or maybe yours faced each day, locked down at home, perhaps with the kids, as I was, trying to get things done on the day-to-day basis, unable to properly teach, unable to properly write or think, because even though things dragged on from moment to moment, I found at least every 24-hour period was essentially identical. It reminded me of when my own children were newborns. And so you just kind of, everything blurred, even though any given moment sort of seemed endless. Now, of course, far better to have a mild case of sort of lockdown ennui than to be in the situation of those who were directly fighting the pandemic or who were victims of it, whose health or lives were devastated by it. And you would see some of those people individually at your door or on social media. And you would see them, or I would see them in the aggregate in the data. And there was so much data generated so fast on COVID. People working at international agencies, universities, newspapers, magazines, state and local government, and the civil sphere more generally, just put out more and more each day, trying to capture the scale and the scope of the pandemic. And with a laptop and some free software and a cup of coffee, I was able to examine, as perhaps you examined, what ought to seem like a staggering quantity of information. So, for example, here's a picture sort of zoomed quite far out, showing what driving patterns look like every day in 100 North American cities over a 4-month period at the beginning of the pandemic. And as if that were a reasonable thing to be able to know while you were confined to your house. And I drew it using information that Apple had been releasing and still is to help researchers quantify the scope of the lockdown around the world. And it's a very large data set. It doesn't count this sort of thing. It has, even though it has millions of rows in it, it doesn't count anymore as as big data. Right? I can look at it as you could look at it on a laptop. Back when I was a graduate student, a distressingly long time ago, I spent 3 days in a library copying down a few hundred numbers by hand from a long shelved report about blood donors. And now, sitting at home, you can survey, or I could survey the scope of what was being inflicted on people across the world as the disease spread, right? And so you just, and so people sometimes kind of talk or complain or believe that working with quantitative data like this kind of inures you to the reality of the human lives that lie behind the numbers, because numbers are crude and measures are bad. They pick up the wrong things. They make it easy to strip out the meaning of what's happening to real people. They make it easy to ignore what can't be counted and so on. But to be honest, I think that this is mostly a sort of an unconvincing critique, at least personally. And I find that far from distancing you from questions of meaning, quantitative data like this really forces you to confront them. And the numbers really draw you in. And working with data like this, I find, and trying to sort of see it in the right way, is a sort of unending exercise in humility, a constant compulsion to think through what you can and can't see in data like this, and to understand what the measures really capture, what they mean, and for whom. And so in this data, kind of, the regular spikes in the data are the pulse of everyday life as people went about their week and went out to have a good time at the weekends. There are peaks around Mardi Gras in New Orleans. There's a bump in Detroit that was a concert just before the lockdown. And then right across the world, you see this sudden shock of the shutdown in the second week of March. That's that blue dip there, as everybody was trying to buy time. And then the gradual return, perhaps, to the baseline of activity from the previous January. And I wasn't the only person trying to look at this data and trying to kind of understand it. Here's a Google Trends just map of kind of interest in the term logarithmic scale during, from the middle of 2019 to the middle of 2020, as people tried to figure out what they were looking at when people shared this sort of data publicly. And so as somebody who works with data like this and tries to share a lot of it publicly and tries to make their own work transparent, our starting point is this combination of the availability of data and excellence of tools that we have for it, and a conviction that, seeing is not as simple as it looks. I'm not the kind of person, even though I really enjoy data visualization and work with it all the time, I don't advocate for it as some sort of, magician's device or a trick that you can perform, or something that just sort of solves all our problems, allows us to see transparently what's really there in the world. Instead, we know right from the ground floor of kind of human perception on up to much more sophisticated and complicated questions of interpretation, looking at things is not straightforward, and it's easy to, in terms of the ground floor, to fool the human visual system, as I'm doing here. Perhaps I hope I'm not making anybody feel ill, as you look at sort of just the way that your eye can be made to think something different. I have a whole collection of these things. The human eye, at the bottom floor, has a way of trying to interpret the world around it, just sort of at the level of pure biology, and then all the way up to much more cultural and cognitive things. And so here, for example, in this famous picture by Edward Adelson, this square is the same shade of gray as this square. And I know that it may seem unlikely, but I promise you that I'm not cheating. Let's just remove all of the pieces from that one at a time in order to show you that that's the case. And it's because your eye, the human eye, is not a light meter. It's very bad at judging absolute values of brightness or luminance. And instead, it looks around for visual cues about what the environment looks like. And so here it's making inferences, so to use an inappropriate sort of language of intention, to see that this is a light square in shadow rather than a dark square in the sun. But it gets the answer kind of wrong because, as I say, our visual system isn't really tuned to see these things properly. So at the very ground floor of visual perception, data visualization is both promising and something that can lead us astray if we're not careful. And so when I think about visualization and when I teach it and try to do it sort of publicly, you think about sort of how to see and where to look and what is visible, and then all of their complements too, like how we don't see sometimes and where we can't look and what is not visible in different settings. Now, within sociology, within the social sciences, data visualization has a very long history of various kinds, often not under that name. Here's a medieval family tree from a church psalter. Kinship, Harrison White remarks somewhere, is the first social science, as people try to figure out the social relations with respect to their own ancestors, their relatives, and their descendants. And so our first sort of efforts at data visualization, if you like, were efforts to draw out these trees of relationships. Substantially later, we see famous data visualizations in sociology looking at sort of urban life, for example. These are the Hull House books on the state of urban life in Chicago in the late 19th century, and where we see, and here a little earlier, one of the earliest really systematic pieces of mixed method social research, if you like, is work done to study poverty in London by Charles Booth and his team of research associates who visited every home in London to map poverty in great detail, right? To show Londoners and this was in the 1880s, what their urban environment looked like, and classified each house and each home by the level of poverty that they found within it. Now, when I say sort of how to look and what to see and what is visible and so on, right? We see that they work with, Booth himself was working with a particularly sort of Victorian conception of poverty, right? And so you see his analysis of these beautiful maps were driven in part by his desire to focus on what he thought of as the poor, those who have a fairly regular, though bare income, 18 to 21 shillings a week for a moderate family, and the very poor, those were the people those are the sort of the deserving poor in his view that he felt should be elevated and their poverty relieved as much as possible. And then at the very bottom there, you can see the very poor, the lowest class, is vicious and semi-criminal. Is this classification, right? So as we're situated in a particular moment historically. You're developing these these theories and methods, and they let you see some things, and then you classify yourself in other ways. The later work by the Hull House people, these divided up things up in terms of income. But one of the great pioneers in American sociology, right, of data visualization was W.B. Du Bois, and this is a fold-out page from the first edition of the Philadelphia Negro, his great study of the Black community in Philadelphia in the very early 20th century, and Du Bois was a pioneer in visualization, but also working in a tradition that he was self-consciously following, that of the Hull House studies first and foremost, and then also Booth before him, who he engages in sort of direct conversation, and from whom he inherits a range of ideas about how to proceed and how to classify. And if you know about, Du Bois himself and his own sociology, here we see essentially Booth's classification, right, with the middle classes. He adds this racial dimension by counting residences of whites and so on, but then he also makes this distinction between the poor and the vicious and criminal classes, right, because Du Bois had this whole elitist dimension to his thought, right. And so any visualization is going to, even from a giant, right, like Du Bois, is going to be dependent on some sort of data that is collected with some sort of picture of the world in mind, that underpinned by theory, and then presented in a way that informs, but also necessarily kind of is informing from a particular point of view. These days, we can do this kind of thing again from our computers, right, from our laptops. And so here's data that I was looking at this morning from the census, which I teach my students this stuff. You write a little bit of code, you talk to a computer, run by the United States government, and you produce a map of the Hispanic population in New York State or New York City by zip code in this case. But again, it would be a mistake to think that, and what I say to people looking at these data all the time is that it's a mistake to think that these zip code categories are in some sense natural, right? They're produced by the post office, and they exist for delivering mail, and so they represent sort of one view of a population filtered through a whole series of decisions about how to proceed. And so when we're thinking about data visualizations, it's not just a matter of looking at a chart and trying to publicize a particular point of view. We want to sort of embed in our own way of working and make clear in our own presentation of results that we're thinking about how to see and where to look and what is visible as we go. Now, for sociologists, right, a lot of this debate is connected to this question or this term of public sociology, and the term originates really in its contemporary phrase with Michael Burawoy, shown here. And in his 2004 ASA presidential address, which you may be familiar with, and he made a really effective, substantive, and polemical case for a certain kind of public engagement that had at its root the public sociologist was a kind of public intellectual, essentially. And his conviction was that sociology's proper sphere was the civil sphere, in the same way that economics claimed the market and political science claimed the state. Sociology fundamentally kind of claimed the civil society. And while he sort of identified four basic kinds of sociology and sociologists, which he labeled professional, policy, critical, and public. So professional are in their ivory tower, and policy are trying to influence the government. Critical are oriented towards professionals, and he would have put himself in that, and focused on strictly intellectual questions. But public were more like sort of organic intellectuals. And so he wanted to emphasize the prospect of unifying those streams also into something new. And the article kind of has this ends in this tremendously optimistic note, right? It's where he really emphasizes the possibility of kind of he's trying to gear up a crowd, right? This is a presidential address, and what's striking about it, of course, is that because it's delivered in 2004, and sociology tries to get on this train and become public, but it's just before, a couple of years later, the iPhone is introduced, smartphones become everywhere, Facebook is founded, Twitter is founded, right? So it's just before this massive transformation of the public sphere itself. So our conception and our first articulation of the concept of kind of public sociology comes into being like just before the entire public sphere changes, and sociology's kind of embrace of I think it's fair to say that the field of sociology didn't quite live up to Burawoy's beautiful vision, because for a while the reaction was kind of essentially inward looking, and a lot of writing and a certain amount of complaining on the topic got published, almost all of it in outlets that were only read by professional sociologists, and often only then with a library subscription. It reminded me of what people used to say about the conceptual efforts of German social theorists in the 1970s, that they had succeeded in unifying theory and practice in theory. And in a similar sort of way, the debate about public sociology succeeded in unifying professional and public sociology in professional journals. Now, people continue to push the argument, though, and I think with some success. Now, the broader public sociology kind of environment, I think, is worth thinking of, right? And considering carefully, because it's a mistake to think that this is just a project that can take place without respect to, for instance, other social sciences or the structure of the public sphere in general. And sociology's public position in traditional media has never been terribly strong, and it's sort of disciplinarily the most heterogeneous and least well institutionalized of the social sciences. And so you can see sort of this with some key work data from the print history of the New York Times over from 1851 to 2015. And the story here is as a familiar one if you're a sociologist, and perhaps somewhat demoralizing. So I won't dwell on it. But the big picture. I would not expect to be different in terms of media outlets, just looking at the relative prevalence of different social sciences. We can also see, if we look at occupational titles only, and including historian, we can see that historians are also extremely prevalent in the public sphere. Now, the New York Times is, standing in here for kind of the world of kind of the public sphere generally, but as I say, I wouldn't expect things to be that different. And so the relative disciplinary authority of fields and disciplinary sort of self-confidence, if you like, is something that you kind of have to situate any thinking about public sociology, its scope and limits within. The New York Times is old media, and so, as I say, things change rapidly in the years after Borwei's initial address. And so the question is kind of, is social media any different? With any new technology like this, it's always tempting to make sort of either strong generational claims about how now we're in a new era and young people are different from older people, or strong sort of technologically determinist claims that now that as new technology has kind of come along, the world has changed completely. And so here's an example from Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, where the commentator here says, an iconic image, not of the election, but of a generation. So you see everybody, trying to take a selfie here with Hillary, and in particular, what he says of a generation is that you can see this fellow here is the boomer in the corner is just is the only one who's sort of facing forward and looking at it, right. And so it's easy to sort of make these kinds of generalizations, although I tend to think that they're mistaken, because this is, and it's by now a very familiar point about the social uses of communication technologies, that the technology is really at a minimum kind of interacting with social practices rather than determining them. And so here's Richard Nixon facing a group of people young people taking photographs of him in 1970 with the then new and exciting Instamatic cameras. I do, though, want to emphasize things that did change a little bit in consequential ways for the public work of social science generally with the rise of social media. And that is the varied effects of kind of disintermediation, visibility, and the measurement or the measurability of one's activities online. And those kinds of and different waves of social media expansion reflect different aspects of that, of each of these processes. So again, considering things over the now kind of pretty much 20-year period since modern social media got off the ground with the world of blogs, through things like Twitter, Facebook, and now on to sort of newer platforms like TikTok or others. What can we say about what it's like to present your work online or try to sort of cultivate an audience? Well, blogging is the oldest of these formats and is now hopelessly unfashionable. I started doing that in the early 2000s, and it's one reason that it's still kind of interest is that there's a very large period effect associated with people who got involved in blogging at around that time, right? People who were in their 20s in the early 2000s. And so there are very often now there are people who are in their 40s or 50s and who are now well entrenched in the chattering classes, people like Ezra Klein or Matt Iglesias or others who are on sort of you see them on TV a lot, or they have their own talk shows and so on. The thing I want to just emphasize briefly about blogs is that they exemplify certain features of social media generally, and then they also sort of prevented some things from happening, or tended to prevent some things from happening that things like Twitter got in the way of. So, for example, the blog I used to write for, I have data for it over a 10-year period when we did pretty well, right? We have until we took away Google's metrics. So I have data on sort of 25 million or so user sessions, over 9.5 million users from about 2005 to 2016. And all I want to emphasize here is, you can see we were sort of steadily popular over the period, maybe in gradual decline towards the end. But still, getting sort of 100,000 or so weekly page views over most of the period. Here's the revenue graph as well over the entire period. That's how much money we made. Because we didn't have advertising, so that means you can trust the user numbers. What I want to emphasize though is just this one metric, the bounce rate, which is here. And so you can see that this was a relatively pointy-headed blog consisting almost entirely of academics, writing for the public, often quite sort of substantial essays. Over the entire period, the average session duration was like less than 3 minutes. Which is how long people spent on it. And the bounce rate, which was what people did next, was like 66% of people just went to a different site once they finished writing that one article. So it's not like they treated this place as kind of an intellectual home. It wasn't some sort of Habermasian ideal of a public sphere where everyone is gathered to reason together or anything like that. They read an article and then they went somewhere else. And 3 minutes, that's a long time in terms of engagement. It's just not a very long time substantively in terms of intellectual life. And so things like Twitter have sort of accentuated that problem or feature of social media to a greater degree, right? So the distribution of followers across Twitter is extremely skewed, right, in terms like logarithmically skewed. And so at the lower end, a large number of nominally existing Twitter accounts are either abandoned or run by bots. And then many people use the service in a fairly low-key way. And then you go up through a series of orders of magnitude of followership till you get to, Barack Obama or Kim Kardashian or somebody, who have millions of devotees. The story is kind of familiar to blogging in terms of people trying to get traction on Twitter as public figures or as public sociologists, which is that sort of taking a press release approach to social media as an individual, as just a regular faculty member or graduate student or whatever, is unlikely to go very well. Individual consistency in terms of identity and presence is what gets rewarded with engagement on Twitter. And occasional appearances to drop a link to your new article into the public sphere will likely be ignored. And so the demand for continuity between who you are and what you say, and the implicit presumption of what we might call kind of discursive availability, is a really double-edged sword in social media, right? That Twitter is fundamentally asymmetric, where there's no obligation to follow people who choose to follow you. But on the other hand, the convention of @replies and so on means that somebody who is tweeting regularly can be engaged with by sort of anybody unless they're actively blocked. And so the predictable result is that users may find themselves in a storm of kind of unwanted or perhaps malicious attention or abusive attention if they say something that's widely retweeted. And of course, some people are much more likely to get this kind of abuse than others. And Twitter's efforts to manage that are unsatisfactory or have been unsatisfactory. And that's at least partly because shutting down this sort of flow of attention is inimical to Twitter's own interests, regardless of how horrible it is for particular users. In the world of blogs, the main form of defense against that was sort of blogs were like a network of islands. And so where they had little comment sections of their own, but it was very difficult for abuse to kind of follow people across the individual websites that you would visit. And there was a certain amount of virality, but like I say, it was more like things would happen on a particular site and somebody else would start talking about it on a different site. But that meant that there was more effort involved in trying to follow conversations between different sites. Whereas the ecology of conversation on Twitter is that even though Twitter generates little communities of that kind, there's like little academic Twitter, and even within there's like geology Twitter, and there's mathematics Twitter, and so on. There's always a constant risk of what the social media people call context collapse, which is just that one thing that somebody says gets yanked out of whatever context it was in. That tweet and that person becomes the main character on Twitter for the day, and is usually sort of pilloried or loved, usually pilloried, depending on the context. And so you can watch yourself, if you're really unlucky, or your friends essentially sort of get swept out to sea by this tsunami of attention, and there's nothing to stop it from happening really on Twitter, and it's against the interests of the platform to make it easier. And so in general, what that means for public engagement is that the better you are, quote unquote, at Twitter, the better you are at generating engagement, well, the worse your experience is likely to be in terms of people abusing you. And so that leads to sort of some perverse outcomes. Facebook's network structure is different. Facebook is very unfashionable now, but it has like 1.5 billion users. And so with Facebook, you have a symmetric network tie, so that if you're friends with someone, they're friends with you, although they have some limited ways of sort of, you don't have to show everything to share everything with everyone, although they kind of want you to. The main thing I would just say about Facebook is that it's this huge, terra incognita in terms of its influence is enormous. It's just very hard to see inside because it's not public in the same way that Twitter is public. And so I know just from hosting stuff on my own website that I got a huge amount of traffic, relatively speaking, from Facebook from time to time, and you just can't see what's going on in there most of the time, right? And so that's so nothing has, so on the one hand, Twitter is kind of full of the chattering classes in public, right? Academics, policy people, journalists, this whole class of individuals, most of whom are the active users there are spending a good chunk of their day on there procrastinating, avoiding work, and looking for a fight, and so get a little jolt of excitement, and so that's you get this ebb and flow of associated with that kind of thing. Whereas on Facebook, you just have there's more structure, but it's harder to see. Finally, there's this sort of more later wave of non-textual social media, things like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, particularly YouTube and TikTok, where you can have a whole world. Certainly, if you're sort of someone who's my age, even if you're have been relatively kind of online for a good chunk of your career, you realize sort of, for instance, on YouTube, there's a world of YouTube where there are people focused on niche interests, perhaps in your area, and they have sort of 2 million viewers on a regular basis, and you've never heard of them. And so that's a sort of thing that's developed over the last decade or so. And then TikTok is similar in a smaller phase. And then the last and most recent wave, which I think we know very little about, is what you might call the kind of refencing of the public sphere through things like Discord, right? Which in many ways recover the structure of that affinity discussion groups on blogs had, except they're not public, right? That you can join them, and there's for people under the age of 25, there are a lot of them will spend a lot of their time, particularly during the pandemic, in engaged in social activity in various Discord servers. Again, that's invisible publicly, but that is extremely active, and unlike blogs, is not only kind of is fully publicly invisible unless you're a member of the blog. And so there's action there that we just really don't know anything about in terms of public impact. So So to finish, so what opportunities are there for social science in the age of social media? I feel like these are not real books, by the way. I feel like the history of sort of, I think of this as kind of classic 1970s social science. The history of social science and social media, or social science and the media, is a mixed one, which is what these books are meant to say. But the optimistic story is one where social science and civil society mutually benefit from the catalytic and connective effects of social media. And civil society is really just mostly what you do in public in your spare time. And so social media as a communications technology disintermediates you and your colleagues and your publics, and it lets you talk to one another and to let the wider world see you in a kind of latently public way. Now, not as a means of actively seeking publicity through press releases, but in principle as a kind of conversation that in principle can be joined by others and seen by others for good and bad. And so when it comes to data visualization, images circulate extremely freely, and they can be very powerful at summarizing large quantities of data in a way that sort of tables or a long discussion cannot be. And so when I circulate something like this, it's primarily because I'm interested in finding something out for myself. It doesn't count considered in isolation as a sort of research formally, right? But certainly not in the strong sense of a peer-reviewed finding with empirical novelty or theoretical significance. In the past, I or academics like me might have made something like this and pinned it on my office door. But now you can just kind of put it up in public and show how you did it. And being able to do that with freely available software when you have access to large quantities of data is, I think, an underappreciated kind of aspect of civic life. It's a way of sharing expertise and demonstrating kind of what it is that you do in using tools that were kind of available, were unavailable until quite recently. And because I run my own website, I can make this quote unquote content available to people in ways that make sure it stays online and rather than just sort of disappearing behind a wall. And I think the demand for this kind of information is much higher. It seems sort of mundane because it's descriptive a lot of the time. It's much higher than a lot of social scientists realize. People are and there's so much disinformation out there that it's good to present stuff in a way that's that's reliable and you do a small bit, if you like, for to sort of fight that kind of disinformation. But as I say, there are sharp limits on what you can expect to achieve, right? So with practice, it becomes a habit that's easy to engage in. A graphical summary like this is a bus ride's worth of data analysis, and it can end up sort of surfacing in the ebb and flow of social media. And material like this should be focused. It should be freely available. If you're a professional academic, you should be able to show what you did. It should be trustworthy. And in short, like if it flows naturally from what you're doing anyway, it can be worth making publicly available. Not, as I say, not as like your findings about something with your special theory attached to it. You can, you focused on the journals for that, but just as data that you're working with, if that's of interest to you, because it helps you answer questions that you didn't know the answer to yourself when you wanted to find out what what it was that was going on. And there's absolutely huge public demand for that kind of thing, from what might seem like sort of basic questions of just what is in the world for social science. So we have an infrastructure of free software now that's really well developed for making plots programmatically like this and reproducibly for many different audiences. But data visualization, of course, is just one way to engage publicly. That's what I've been asked to talk about. But writing, discussion, critique, and commentary are all in principle available as well. And they also work to sustain the kind of small professional publics that make for good discussion. Now, as I say, the downside is that an open, context-collapsed public sphere is not some sort of Habermasian ideal. This is from last night. So the worms in the apple, this is somebody accusing me of being a eugenicist because I posted a risk profile by age of COVID mortality. So harassment, abuse, and backbiting is a problem deeply entwined with the structure of open network architectures. And so it's one thing to do some quantitative data analysis if you're a slightly irritable looking white tenured professor at a fancy university like me. and you still get some abuse, but it's another altogether to cut into topics where your opponents really hate you, truly, for who you are. You know, a robust community can be a strong defense against that kind of thing, but it's not easy to construct out of nothing. And the platform in something like Twitter provides essentially no tools for defending against harassment. And so Twitter has these kind of perverse features built in. The second worm is, I think of as kind of measurement, right, or metrics. Because social media enables communication, but also traffic and measurement and measures of success. And so this creates a new round of status-based processes kind of at the level of the individual, and institutional structuration at the level of organizations. And as blogging developed, for instance, universities were initially clueless and just ignored it. But a decade later, they all began to scramble to get on board with institutional blogs and measurements of participation and impact metrics. And that's great in one sense, but also the downside of recognizing public engagement as a real activity, right? So once your dean or your department chair recognizes that this thing is happening, well, they would like to measure it. And once they measure it, they want to rank it. And so the dead hand of either bureaucracy or the market threatens to invade civil society once more. And in the words of my friend Chris Bertram, a public role that you had then becomes an administrative goal, with the result that something like engagement tends to stop being the sort of thing you do in your spare time that's relevant to your work, and starts being more like a string of brochures or press releases for research or op-ed pieces. Again, the sort of as you're focused on cultivating impact kind of as a measurable quantity, and the individual level equivalent to that kind of degenerate sort of outcome is just being endlessly focused on engagement, even if it's bad, right? That you just start to like getting into fights with people and being out in public, and that's very unhealthy. So as I've tried to argue, to conclude, an alternative way of seeing things recognizes that there's no real impact without good prior work. And of course, there's no good work without people who care about what they're doing. And I think we should take the opportunity to at least carry on at least some of the business, the everyday business of doing real research in this sort of newly public or semi-public field. And over the long term, I think that's the main foundation on which reasonable norms of public engagement for academics kind of need to be built, that you're working in this kind of latently public way. And a key source of resistance to that idea, of course, is academics themselves, because it's not hard to find that somewhat reasonable when what you're resisting is demands for measure-driven impact that you're not interested in participating in. But I find that academics resist on the civil society side too, because it may be that because while civil society is what you do in public in your spare time, serious academics aren't supposed to have any free time, and they certainly are not supposed to be seen spending it in public. Instead, their waking hours are meant to be spent as serious people devoted to the research effort, without exception. And everyone knows that that's incompatible with being seen in public. But then on the other hand, being seen in public has some status enhancing benefits, and so there's a sort of politics of recognition and status that comes with that. But in any case, I do think that regardless of your view on that side, I prefer to see it as a sort of civic sociability and not as a matter of professional service and an ordinary aspect of intellectual life is how I view it. But either way, in the age of social media that we now seem to be living in, I think we need to decide kind of whether to work in this latently public, ambiently visible way, and how to do it effectively if we try. And I feel that data visualization is a good way to do that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Healy, for that. And I think going on your own argument, I'd like to suggest that you yourself really are always just looking for a fight. You just told a whole bunch of people with blogs that no one cares about their blogs. Anyway, so I'll turn it over now to Cary to continue with the conversation.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Kieran, for a really great talk. At York, we have a resource center for public sociology, and Sylvia is the director. When she asked me to give a talk, to think about what is public sociology and how to do public sociology, and I was also preparing a course, data visualization course, and I was reading Kieran's work and then following his website, blogs, and then like he has done so, like in terms of like data visualization, and then blogs, writing blogs, and the Twitter follow, even Twitter, like he has so many followers, right? So thinking about who is the best person in the world to talk about data visualization as public sociology, and that's Kieran. Right? So I knew it was him, so I invited him and to come over to give us this like wonderful talk, and thank you for that. So my job here is just to share a little bit about my observation about the data visualization, right? Just to promote conversation and then discussions. And I do not have the setup like Kieran's setup, but I do have some slides to share. So I will talk about 6 observations to just promote discussion and conversations. First one is data visualization can be a matter of life and death. I think Kieran already made the point, right? So this is one we got like polar area diagram was created almost 200 years ago, right? So you see, this is a great example of data visualization showing that the role data visualization plays in, for example, in spreading medical knowledge, right? So this is figure created by Nightingale, right? On the left panel, you see the blue represent the death from preventable disease. And then on the right, on the left panel is 1 year after. And then in the April, March of 1855, this measures were being taken to reduce the measures, control measures to prevent the disease from preventable disease, the death. So you see huge decline from the death from preventable disease. So this shows that the effective of those measures being taken. Nightingale herself is a nurse, right? So this is like early data visualization. Data visualization, like Kieran mentioned, is a long history, right? But also think about pandemic, right? Like Kieran, during early stages of the pandemic, I also every morning I woke up, I look at the data from across countries, right? So data visualization play a very important way in, for example, political response to the pandemic and also social responses to the pandemic. And they have shaped political policies, have shaped public behaviors, right? So this is just one example about mask wearing, right? During early stages, a lot of like research, a lot of media narratives, or even public conversations saying that mask wearing is no use in preventing, right? But when research coming out and data visualization, such of those kind of data visualization were used, then mask wearing become more publicly accepted by many people around the world, right? And then it helped. A lot of research shows that, for example, this data visualization shows that it helps prevent or fighting for the pandemic, right? So it's data visualization is a matter of life and death. And second observation is, Kieran mentioned that data visualization oftentimes is just part of research, peer review article, part of like a way to turn analysis into graphics. So make the analysis or empirical results easy to follow, right? But this point, I'm saying that data visualization now has become a research product, right? So this is just one example from Kieran. The ASA have a couple of journals now, they publish data visualization, right? So this is one article thinking about to illustrate the baby boomers in the United States compared to other countries. You see people were born during after the Second World War, 1946, you see the color shows that the differences in terms of like how the power of data visualization can tell a story or illustrate concepts that we talk about in our everyday life, right? So the point is that data visualization has become a research product, can be peer reviewed, can be published. And if you look at especially public health journal, for example, New England Journal of Medicine, you see that they have letters to editor, and then that letters just usually publish one data visualization or figures, graphs, or one table, right? Just tell to communicate a finding, and that matters. And it's oftentimes it's also peer review and can be part of as a research product too. It's not part of the research, but itself as research product. And second, a third point I want to say that data visualization is also a research method, right? So a lot of time when we think about data visualization, we think about, it just turn those data, visualize the data, or turn those data information into graphics and all that, right? But it's not that simple, right? Data visualization can help, especially when we think about data-driven research, or data visualization itself can help us lead to new discoveries, right? So this is one example I was working on. This is very simple data visualization, but I was working on how men and women, gender trajectory of the share of infections over time in Canada. And only doing this kind of data visualization, we can see that women are most vulnerable during COVID peaks, during the peak time. So in Canada, we have almost 5 waves of pandemic. And in each wave, during the peak times, the share of women in infection is the highest. It's the highest. So without data visualization, it's difficult to observe this, the fact that women can be most in particular vulnerable during COVID peaks. And we have experienced multiple waves. And during peak times, women, the infection ratio, women to male infection ratio is the highest. And then in each of the 5, across the 5 major pandemic waves. So data visualization can lead to new discovery, right? It's not just describing or visualize the results analysis, but sometimes can lead to new discovery. And it can be an effective research method, thinking about that as a method that for knowledge creation and then scientific discovery. And then number 4 is data visualization also includes theory visualization, right? So when we think about data, we often think about numbers, even the text data, information, those like data. But when in sociology or in a lot of, for example, research publication, you see researchers often present some theoretical framework, right? So visualize the theoretical framework. Theory visualization is also data visualization, right? Ideas can be visualized, theories can be visualized, and then that visualizing theory, visualizing ideas also help, right? When we think about public sociology or how to communicate research knowledge to more general public or people from, for example, outside sociology or like cross-disciplinary exchange of knowledge, right? So those theory, idea visualization is also part of data visualization, right? So this is, for example, when we think about network theory, right? It's a great example thinking about network theory as a theory, and then you immediately you will think about the network and then the data visualization, the connection, the linkage, and that helps people to, for example, understand what is network theory and how like the power of the ties between people across organizations or that. And then point 5 is data visualization requires a critical perspective, right? So this is very important. Kieran mentioned that we really need to be very careful in terms of reading those figures or visualizing the data, or how to represent or tell the story using the data, right? Because the data, we can use the data to lie or to like sometimes misrepresentation of the data can lead to a lot of. So this is one point about being careful of data visualization. Second is that when visualization become very popular, we also need to think about people that, for example, blind people, they won't be able to see data visualization, no matter how beautiful you are creating those visuals, right? Or people who have like lack of data literacy is also very important, right? So think about general public, thinking about when we use visuals using graphs to communicate with the public, we also need to be inclusive, thinking about how to include people, for example, disabled people or people like thinking about data literacy and all those kind of social issues, right? So one example is a group of York scholars, they're turning all those visuals, data graphs, they're developing techniques, turning all those figures out there, like in Twitter or public media, turning those figures into text. So people, for example, blind people or are able to follow, are able to read, understand this form of, for example, knowledge sharing or knowledge product. Finally, is data visualization as everyday interaction, right? So, for example, just a couple of days ago, I was asking my friend in Shanghai how bad is the city lockdown, right? He didn't say much, but sent me this Google GPS kind of like visuals, right? To see how bad is a lockdown in Shanghai, the city, right now, right? So in Shanghai, you can't go anywhere. Driving or so the whole city is locked, right? So this is so one way of thinking about that everyday interaction, use visuals. That's the power of data visualization, information visualization. And then as we think also like emojis is a data visualization, right? So I use emojis very often, and then emojis as a great example of data visualization as an everyday interaction. Right, so those points, I'm just sharing those kind of points to have a discussion. So we have a lot of time, so we can.
Thank you very much, Cary, for that, for those really great points. I took away theory, data visualization, and I think Rita also wrote that in the chat. Very interesting to think about theory visualized in the way that you presented it. But anyway, so now I'm opening the virtual floor for your questions, contributions, chats, points of agreements, and even fights, if you are so inclined. So you can put up your hand, you can type it in the chat, and we will go from there. I will switch to gallery view so I can see everyone in case people have hands up. Yes, Alexandra and Margaret, I'll have a speakers list going, but I'll start with Alexandra and Margaret. So you can unmute and speak.
Hi, I don't know if Alexandra wants to go first.
No, sorry, I didn't have my hand up.
Okay. All right, then Margaret, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to both speakers for interesting presentations. There's an anthropologist in the room as well, a sociologist, so I just thought I'd mention that. Neither of you mentioned the use of data visualization for sort of political agendas. So, for example, in global health, which is an area that I research, data visualization infographics are often used by again, I'll just use an example from my own area. For organizations, for example, to establish the fact of maternal mortality as an issue worthy of attention and political attention. And it's meant literally to speak to politicians to generate political will, as well as to inform the public, as well as to inform, to share information amongst researchers and organizations that deliver, global health services. So I wondered if you, one or both could talk about the use of data and data visualization in that way, with a very explicit, often with a very explicit agenda, even if it's an agenda for good, to establish that this is a problem, attention must be paid. Like, no, the idea of no data, no problem. Like, if you don't have the data to show it's a problem, that problem doesn't exist. That's something that circulates in the global health world. If there's no data, there's no problem.
Sure, I'm happy to address that. Well, that last way of putting it seems, straightforwardly false, and that would be hard to sort of endorse. It does speak. Just the second point about, if we can't count it, then we can't see it, is this attitude. Or if we can't count it, then I refuse to see it, which is a sort of somewhat more, that's a much stronger position, right? I would say a couple of things. One is, very generally, I typically sort of think about visualization as just one of many tools that we have for both investigating the world and then also making arguments about it, about what we find. And there isn't any, if we start making a list of the virtues that we would like good data visualizations to have in the context of, let's say you're trying to convince somebody of something in that context. Well, maybe you would say, well, I would like it to be clear and informative. I would like it to be, truthful, and to focus on the correct aspects, and to highlight the things that I feel that when you and to be perhaps well organized and concise and so on. All of those virtues, they're also what you would say of kind of any other way of trying to convince somebody of something, right? That's what you'd say about the Toronto bus timetable. You'd like it to you would like it to be well laid out, clear, correct, and appropriate in the information that it tries to convey, convincing, and so on. So there isn't sort of anything special from my point of view about visualizations in the sense of like it as a kind of tool. They're one thing that we use. They can be effective in their way because of the impact that they can have, just because they can be striking. But like a short discussion or a speech or a piece of text, or other things can be striking in their own way too. And the virtues that we want from good data visualizations aren't any different from the virtues that we want from any other piece of sort of something that we use to try and convince people. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the second part would be that the role that a visualization has in the context of trying to get attention or raise awareness or bring focus to some topic raises questions again that are different from the kind of role that a visualization would play kind of as you're exploring data yourself, for instance, as you're and again, just as like let's say you're an ethnographer and you have a tremendous amount of field notes and interviews and observations from your field site. When you're looking through that yourself and organizing it, you approach the data one way and represent it to yourself and select it one way. And then when you're writing up your article and presenting the results to an audience, well, then you select various pieces of it that most convey strikingly what it was that you found, or the thing that you want to argue. And the same sort of principles apply in either case, which is to say that like you're always on the lookout. You should approach it in a sort of intelligent and reflexive way, being aware that people are when you're exploring data yourself and when you're trying to convince other people, you're looking for patterns. Visualizations are really good ways of showing patterns, but we're also people are just good at seeing things that aren't there, and so when you have this sort of obligation in any form of research to try and to make sure that you're not misleading other people, or you're not fooling other people, and in particular that you're not fooling yourself, right, when it comes to looking at your data. And visualization is a particularly good way to bring that out, just because we're constantly looking for patterns in data. You know, human beings are pattern finding animals, and that what that means in practice is that you are sort of the easiest person to fool when it comes to looking at your own data, because you want those patterns to be there, and so but in general, as I say, the kind of the general considerations that apply to the use of a data visualization to convince other people of something, or a data visualization to explore data yourself, are I think, when you get right down to it, they aren't any different from the sorts of standards you would apply to any other piece of evidence or method of presenting it. They have their appropriate quirks and so on, but fundamentally, what you're trying to do is the same thing.
Great question. I just want to add a little thing about the data collection or data visualization can be political, right? So one example is when we think about Canada, like we have different political strategies to promote racial relationship compared to the US, right? So in the US, all the data, survey data, race is the main variable they will collect, but not here in Canada. In Canada, we're debating whether we should collect race, ethnicity kind of data, right? And then oftentimes in the survey, they are not collecting those data. And then even they collect the data, they're not released to the public, right? So they don't want you, maybe researchers, to think about race and ethnicity as in the US, the way that in the US, as a political strategies or ways to promote. For example, here we promote multiculturalism. In the US, it's a different story, thinking about racial relationships, right? So that's one example. Second example is data collection, data visualization can be like used in political control, right? So think about in China, like how they collect data, what kind of data they collect, and how they visualize or like communicate, or that what kind of data visualization are allowed and not allowed. Is like now it becoming, because social media become the main way of controlling public opinion, and although so data visualization is like effective way for political leaders to control the public, right? So just two examples thinking about how data visualization, data collection can be very political.
Thank you both. Thanks.
Yeah, as we wait for other questions, I also wanted to add this as something to think about and ask. Cary, you talked about data visualization as a research method, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit, especially in areas that perhaps don't necessarily lend themselves to data collection in those ways that may enable visualization in the way that you are imagining, and also in terms of how we do public engagements in this age of social media, and not to be overly, not to go to that other bit of, technological determinism or social media. But what happens when, especially when you put out an infographic, for instance, as an example, and it goes viral, and then it is photoshopped in different ways, you're not even, what are some of the considerations, especially as you think about that? And I'll take a question from Leslie so that you can answer them together. Leslie, go ahead.
Thanks. And thanks for terrific presentations. I mean, I buy it. We got to do this. It's good, it's useful, and we have to be critical for the ways that you both pointed out. And I guess my question, I really wanted to say something similar to what Sylvia was talking about, of the pressure, and I guess it's really what you were speaking about as well. The pressure to, there's increasing pressure to communicate quickly and in images. and all the social media pushes it to do this. And then once you engage, you know, you've turned your theory, you've turned your 300-page book into an infographic. It's it's circulated, and then you get attention, and the next thing you know, you're asked to produce an infographic on some other thing that you don't know quite as well. And so I'm just I am, you know, a little bit wary about the pressure, because to engage increasingly, that then has the potential to undermine kind of more in-depth, slower, more careful work. I mean, I don't know. I maybe you're more resistant than I am, but I know that sometimes, you know, you get called by random journalists and they're like, "Can you talk about this?" And you're like, "Well, I could talk about it." But next thing you know, right, there's a legitimacy, and then there's a blurring. And I guess if I could turn that into a question, it would be something about quality, maintaining quality and speed, right, in this context.
Kieran, you want to go first?
No, sure. I mean, yeah, sure. Why not? So you know, both these points are well taken. I think that again, there's there's two pieces, right? There's the specific method. We're taking some data and we're making pictures with it. And how do we do that properly? And there's a bunch of questions that, you know, the sort of how do we do that properly and well that arise with literally any method that you would, right? And so, you know, you want to abide by, you know, good scholarly standards and for whatever is appropriate. And I'm very like that's why I was trying to make that, you know, insisting on that at the beginning, is that like I'm not some sort of evangelist for, in the sense that like everybody should be doing this, either on the data visualization side or, you know, being on Twitter. I strongly recommend not being on Twitter, in fact. So there's the method side, and then there's this there's the sort of public part, and the hinge, as Leslie you very nicely brought out, is like, well, if you convert something into an image, then it circulates. Now the thing, of course, is right that, and Sylvia, you're making this point too, that you know, you can convert a quotation into an image too, and that's the sort of thing that also circulates like crazy, right? Or a misleading video, or you know, all kinds of things. And so those general questions about the state of the public sphere are sort of they apply to kind of any piece of information that circulates quickly, and the image circulation is really not just about a graph or an infographic, but it can just be like about a quote or misattribution. So, you know, in a similar kind of way. So yeah, that I mentioned, maybe I didn't bring it out sort of extremely strongly in the talk, but that's one of the things. Like personally, I talk about things on Twitter, but there's a sort of record of stuff that I do that's on my website, and then there are publications, and that's like the front end of things, and then that I keep sort of that's there and fairly stable, and then there's the actual scholarship, right? Things like academic articles and monographs and books and so on, and so, you know, the further somebody wants to go, the further they're welcome to do it. But that sort of the need, I think you're absolutely right. Like the need to keep some sort of chain of attribution and reliability is something that scholars have to, you know, like already care about and ought to care about even more in this kind of environment. And unfortunately, like the power of these kinds of media is such, like the speed and the rapidity of diffusion and the ability to sort of the threat of context collapse, which is to say that you can just yank an image or a quote, right, or anything just right out of whatever context it was in, and then circulate it like as an independent entity. You know, these are really these genuinely are kind of like worrying and disturbing kind of aspects of large scale social media, and not ones that people like that academics are or really should be expected to have like straightforward and reliable answers or means of dealing with it. So I don't see anything wrong with kind of not. That's why I don't like the way, you know, pressure from administrations, for example, to sort of say, well, everybody should be sort of out there publicizing their research and working to turn to turn 10 years worth of scholarship into like a picture, you know, which you can, or a soundbite. Like, you know, there are people who like to do that kind of thing, but there's really no. That's not what like universities should be in the business of doing, and so and indeed the entire structure of universities, both as organizations as a whole and then internal to them, is about creating like little modules where there are barriers to crossing them. Like I know, like maybe that sounds a little weird to put it that way, but sort of, you know, university departments are the original sort of safe spaces, right? Where it's like you come to a seminar, you need a qualification to get in, and it's not like somebody from the physics department can show up, even like another academic, and just tell you that you don't know how you're doing your work or you're doing it wrong. And you can't do that either. You can't go over to chemistry and say, you know what, you guys are doing everything wrong, right? So the structure, our structure of knowledge is sort of, even though interdisciplinarity is wonderful and so on, or the structure of knowledge is set up to defend patient scholarship and focus on detail and long-term investment, and it should remain that way if possible. And so, yeah, so there are a lot of difficult choices to make then when it comes to kind of publicizing your work, and there's nothing. I have no sort of straightforward answer to the question of like, if people are determined to be dishonest, or if people are determined to propagate disinformation, then those are sort of serious, ultimately political kind of problems that are intrinsically difficult to manage. And there isn't a sort of individual level, well, here's a strategy that you personally as a faculty member should follow that will help you avoid this ever happening to you. And unfortunately, yeah, that's not incredibly satisfying as an answer, but I think that's the situation that we're in.
Great question. So I would think about data visualization as a research method. Then we think about research methods, right? Think qualitative methods or quantitative methods. Those methods really essentially, I was thinking is essentially we're just reducing those massive data or complicated data, turn those data into like what identified patterns, right? So that's research methods. Like we identify qualitative interview data or from survey responses to finding those patterns, right? So this what we call research methods. And data visualization itself is, for example, reducing the massive data, turn big data into very simple visuals, graphs with tables, right? Or when we think of a survey regressions, essentially regressions is calculating the means or that, right? So visualization can be considered as part of like research methods itself, because it helps identify the patterns, can lead to new discovery, and it also like really turn those massive information into like patterns, codes, right? And then the second question from lastly, yes, like thinking about the speed of like doing research, visualizing knowledge, or like how to create those knowledge. Sometimes when we think about like, so that's when we think about knowledge creation, if it's knowledge creation, right? If we don't spend much time or not being too careful, then sometimes could lead to errors and all that, and the misrepresentation of the data and all that. But then I want to add, based on my experience, is that when we think about especially survey data regressions, like the clear describing the data can help readers or for researchers to really present the findings in a way that is regression tables cannot, right? So in the sociology, in political science, we have those debate about like p-value or p-hacking, right? When we present those regression output, a lot of times that the significance or p-values won't be able to tell us what's really going on. Therefore, like data visualization is required, right? So a lot of times in a survey research papers, publications, you often see or data table figures are required, and that figures can tell us what's going on, not the regression tables. So, and then that tables also tell us, like, for example, when we think about a gender gap in income, a racial gap in income, sometimes the gap can be just $2, but can be very significant, right? But then when we visualize the $2 annual income, does $2 really mean much? Or what's the meaning of the $2 gap, right? So regression won't be able to tell us, but visualize the $2 gap can tell the story. And then that's the one way to avoid, for example, p-hacking or those just looking for significancy.
Thank you very much. And we have a question in the chat. Where do you start if you want to learn data visualization? Recommendations for specific softwares?
No one can answer this question better than Kieran. Okay, go ahead, Kieran.
Right. Yeah. So clearly, yeah, all right. This is where I pitch my book, right? So I mean, I'll tell you what I use myself. A lot depends on the what you see yourself using visualization for and how often. And so, if you're somebody who wants to do it occasionally for data that that you have some small amount of information or relatively manageable amounts of information that you want to sort of construct into an infographic or something like that, or a reasonable graph, well then, straightforward off-the-shelf tools like spreadsheets have built-in capabilities that you can work with, and what you need to do is sort of read a book like Edward Tufte's The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, which is not about software, but it's just about principles. And there are many good books along those lines. Tufte's was the first, but there's just good things on the principles of how to make a chart, and then sort of see if you can do it in a piece of software like, I don't know, Microsoft Excel or something. If you're going to be working with quantitative data a lot, then it's worth investigating what tools are available in the software that you're using to analyze your data. And so I use R for everything, and the ggplot library is the toolkit for visualization that I use with that. And this book that I wrote, the introductory book, teaches you how to use that. There's a website where you can see the whole book. The final draft of it, just for free. So I'm not making you buy it. And it's sociviz.co. So that would be, if you're going to be working with quantitative data regularly, then yes, you should learn like R and learn how to manipulate data, because that gives you, there's like more of a learning curve for something like that. But then once you get up the hump, you're on your way to being able to do all kinds of things, very powerfully. So that's the main thing. But it depends, as I say, on like what you take to be your use case, right? That some people, like for some people, learning R and ggplot is not going to be worth the investment, just given what they know about, or what you know about your own need for visualization. But for others, if you're a beginning graduate student in social science, and social sciences, and you're going to be working with quantitative data, then absolutely, I think, yeah, you should learn something like R and how to draw graphs with it.
I just want to add the book from Kieran, like really hands-on, very simple, clearly written, and like introduce like how the general public, like you don't need massive knowledge of like math or like prior knowledge of all that. You just get on and then we'll be able to. Right, so this will be, if I'm doing,
I will say, yeah, thank you, Cary. I mean, that's very generous. I will say that the motivation for writing that book was trying to sort of satisfy what I thought was like a big hole in the market, which was that there are books like Tufte's book, and many others that will show you and tell you a lot of useful things about the principles of constructing good graphics from data. And they have all these beautiful pictures in them, and you're like, wow, that's fabulous. How do I do that? And the books aren't about that. They're just about showing you, like, well, here's what the principles are. And then on the other side, there are books that are more like software manuals, and that are, and if you're not comfortable with that kind of thing, they're often not very well written, or they have a technical focus that they're not for kind of instructing you. And so this book in the middle, what I wanted to do was to write a book that showed you lots of nice pictures, but then literally sort of there was the code to actually make them, so that and so that's what that book tries to do. And then because I feel like the nice thing about data visualization in general can be a really effective way into just learning more about how to do quantitative analysis, because you get and learning how to program in something like R or Python or something, because what you get right, you can get sort of feedback, you get satisfying results more or less immediately, because you draw something you can see and you're like, oh, that's really nice, as opposed to sort of having to, well, I get a table of numbers that I don't quite understand, or I'm not quite sure what to do with yet. There's a sort of, there can be a kind of long time to wait for payoff for learning certain kinds of programming techniques, whereas with data visualization, relatively quickly you can get to the point where you're producing things that you're like, wow, that's good enough to appear in a journal, and so it can be. So that's why I think that I advocate for visualization as a really good place to just start learning about programming and statistics generally.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cary, did you want to say anything else?
So one thing I want to add is that, look, for example, the codes Kieran shared look very scary, right? But the only thing that you just need to know what kind of visuals you want. And if you're using R, for example, you will always be able to find those codes. And then you just do a little revision of those codes, they are able to create all those like figures, visuals that you hope to create, right? So it's like really, it's an open sources, and then that can be find the codes, like you can search the codes online very easily.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any other hands that are raised or any other questions, but I will give it a second, even though we are right at the mark for closing the conversation. So if I see a hand, I will stop to ask for the final question or so. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this really fantastic conversation about data visualization. One of the things that came to mind when you were talking, and especially also with the audience that we have in the room today, that perhaps data visualization is the interdisciplinary language that we actually need as sociologists to communicate across disciplinary backgrounds, especially outside of the social sciences, to others in other fields. And that's one of the other things to think about in terms of how people use data from different perspectives, as Cary was saying, as a research method, but the entry points may be different. So and thank you for also speaking about issues around civic sociability in this age, and some of the concerns that have been raised from the audience around how we engage in a fast-paced, while still trying to do very good sociology and trying to impact policy positively. So thank you so much, Dr. Healy and Dr. Wu, for spending your afternoon with us, and thank you to everyone who made it to our very last public sociology conversation from the Resource Center for Public Sociology. We are really grateful that you stuck with us throughout the year. Look forward to more conversations in the future. This conversation is being recorded, and you'll soon see that it's up on our YouTube page. Of course, follow us on Twitter. It can be a very lonely space sometimes if you don't have followers, but it's been fantastic. I also want to thank Susan Speary so much for doing all of the background logistics and work to make sure that everything here has been successful. So thank you so much, and have a great weekend ahead.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.